Hi everybody, and welcome to Garden Style. So I hope all of you, at least most of you here in the country, have survived the extremely cold temperatures that we have all seen in this past week. Not only cold temperatures, but snow and ice. It's been quite the winter just in the last 5 days. But now that we're starting to climb out of it and temperatures are starting to warm, I know a lot of you are starting to get really itchy to get out into the garden and start planting. But today I thought I would cover a few things that you can do to prevent funguses in your gardens in the early spring. And this is something that you can use, these are practices you can use all the way through the summer and the late fall as well. So the first thing I want to do is get you familiar with 3 major funguses that we all deal with at least once a year out in our gardens and fight with it. The very first one is gray mold, or what they call botrytis. That is its scientific name. Now, gray molds need 3 things to really get started. And the key ingredient is, of course, moisture, water. The second ingredient is really cool temperatures. And the third ingredient is lack of air circulation. So if you own a greenhouse, or you have plants that are planted too closely together, or if you're even trying to start seedlings, this botrytis little mold can just be a huge hassle and something that you can prevent in the long run. Now, gray molds can grow quickly, especially in very damp, cramped conditions with lack of air circulation. So the very first thing you want to do is start putting in some preventatives for gray mold. And that is obviously a little less moisture, so things that aren't as damp, warmer temperatures, and plenty of air circulation. If you start to get those 3 things into place, then usually it'll go away. As soon as the temperature rises, then it just seems to magically disappear because it is no longer an inhospitable environment to grow. So I'm going to put a picture of what the gray mold is down here at the bottom, and you can see it's a very fuzzy, fine type of mildew, mold. And once it gets started, it can easily kill your plant quickly, especially if it reaches the stems now down near the soil surface, and that's usually the first place you will see it start. And most of your molds and mildews start from spores. So I know your first reaction is to go in and just start getting rid of it. You start rubbing it off with your fingers or whatever. I would not recommend that, especially if you're in a greenhouse or in a tight growing space, like you're trying to start seedlings, that sort of thing. Quarantine the plant or plants that has the powdery mildew, or I don't want to call it powdery mildew because that's a whole other fungus. Go ahead and set it aside, quarantine it. As soon as you see that downy kind of softness, it almost looks like fine feathers that you would find on a duck or something. It's just real fine. You want to set those plants aside and quarantine them before you start to address the issue. And the reason for that is they all start from spores. And as soon as you touch it, you are instantly sending those spores into the air so that they can fly somewhere else and land somewhere else on your plants. So try and quarantine them unless you have, a huge crop that has suddenly succumbed to it. And then it's time to pull out the big guns. And right here behind me I have a whole row of different things that you can use for downy mildew, as they call it, or botrytis. And the very first thing you can start to use is neem oil. And this seems to be a favorite with a lot of gardeners, not only because it's good for preventing funguses, but it's also good at preventing insects as well. And if you start applying this to a lot of your new plants or during conditions that seem to be really damp, you can usually stave off any type of botrytis from spreading to the rest of your plants. Now, I would certainly treat the plant or plants that already has the fungus attached to them. You can try the neem oil. There are several other things that you can try. There are liquid copper fungicides that you can use. This one happens to be a liquid. It also comes in a powder if you prefer to use a powder. All the instructions are on the back. Most of these are organic. So a lot of these you can apply towards your fruits, vegetables, and be able to eat them either the same day or the day after treatment. Also, there is another really neat fungicide, and this is probably one of my favorites, and this is called Serenade. And it's actually a bacteria, a natural bacteria that gets applied to leaves as well as the surface of the soil. And it acts in a natural way to literally eat up whatever spores or funguses have landed on your plants. Another way to go about treating your plants is with a systemic fungicide. And this just happens to have a real high phosphorus, if I can talk today, content. And this is something you can spray on, or you can actually apply it with a watering can into the soil and water it in. And what the plants are going to do is take the systemic up inside of the plant, which in turn gives it an inhospitable place for funguses to start. So those are just a few of the chemicals, and I don't really think of them as chemicals because most of these are an all-natural way of dealing with funguses. You can also use a home remedy like baking soda, for instance. Take 2 tablespoons of baking soda to a gallon of water, maybe add a tablespoon of vegetable oil, and that'll help all of it to literally stick to the leaves. And once it's there, it'll help stave off any other spores from landing on those leaves and getting started. Now I must reiterate that it's really important when you go to treat for a lot of these funguses that you also treat the soil. The spores have landed all over the soil as well as over the leaves and underneath the leaves. So it's good to give them a real good soaking type treatment. You want to do it on a day where it's dry, or it's going to be dry for at least 24 to 48 hours, so watch your weather. And do some of these preventatives, like your neem oils as well as the Serenade are 2 excellent preventatives that I always recommend to gardeners when they're getting out into the garden for the first time and they're starting to notice these horrible funguses getting started on their plants. The second fungus I want to talk about is powdery mildew. Now, powdery mildew needs some slightly different conditions than what a downy mildew would need or botrytis would need. And that is high humidity and warm temperatures. So usually with powdery mildew, you'll see it getting started, say for instance, on your squash plants. Squash, cucumbers are famous for getting powdery mildew towards the middle to the end of the summer. And that's usually when it's hot. Maybe you had a rain overnight, a real light rain, which helped to raise the humidity, and that is just perfect conditions for powdery mildew to get started. Now the powdery mildew shows up as white, and you'll start to see it spread on the surface of the leaves, and it starts to get worse and worse and worse, and then you'll start to notice it starting to head its way down the stems. Now what you can do to prevent this ahead of time is, first of all, make sure you have good air circulation. As you know, when you get towards the middle, the end of the summer, and your squash leaves are huge, you've been picking fruit, and things are just getting thick in the vegetable garden, go ahead and start cutting off some of the older yellowed leaves and the ones that you see are infected with the powdery mildew. Now, it may not kill the plant. I've had a plant, completely turn white and still produce fruit, and it's usually by the end of the summer, and I'm really not caring a whole lot about the plants anymore anyway, as they're right on the edge of dying for the year, and I've gotten my fruit. But it looks bad, and I certainly don't want to encourage it to start spreading its spores and laying dormant during the wintertime and getting started all over again the following season. So I always recommend cutting off as many of the leaves as you can and open up the plant. Open it up as much as you can to allow air circulation. And that way, if you're having rain and real high humidity, that will help at least move some air through the plant and try to calm down the powdery mildew that's getting started on your plants. However, you can still use a lot of these products to prevent the powdery mildew. I like liquid copper fungicide, especially in the late summer. It seems to be very effective. Neem oils and the Serenade tend to be more preventative. Neem oil works up to a point in getting rid of the powdery mildews, but I think of these two more as a preventative. And then you can go with a systemic or with the liquid copper fungicide if you're trying to get rid of it. And you may have to spray this once every 7 days or every 7 to 10 days. If it rains heavily, you may have to reapply it again. But after about 2 or 3 treatments, you should be on top of it. Some other things you can do to prevent powdery mildews and funguses from starting. is of course to keep any debris, old debris, leaves, and everything clean from the soil surface. And you always want to use a mulch. Cover the soil surface with a mulch, like a bark mulch or a pine mulch, some sort of natural mulch, and that also helps keep the spores from hitting the soil and splashing back up onto the plant, say when you're getting a really hard rain. Or just a couple things that you can do to help prevent these things from spreading even further to other plants out in the garden. Now, another fungus I want to talk about is leaf spot. And the most famous black leaf spot that you're going to see usually shows up on roses. Roses seem to be very vulnerable to black spot, although you may notice it on your fruit trees. You may notice it on your vegetable plants. And again, it needs those same conditions where it's just damp and wet, things are constantly staying wet, and those funguses get started on those leaves, and then suddenly you start to see all these black spots showing up. I've had people come in and they're in a panic because their entire rose bush is covered in black spot fungus. So usually, if it gets that bad, it's usually been a really, really wet winter as well as early spring. So the best thing you can do is, of course, you're going to be trimming your roses anyway, usually in late February, beginning of March. So you trim them back, and you want to make sure to clean all the debris and any kind of old leaves from underneath the plant. Usually, those leaf spot spores are hanging around down in the soil surface if they're not already floating through the air. So that's one preventative you can do, and then of course lay a mulch of some sort, and that helps protect the soil underneath and keeps any other spores from splashing back up on the plant. Once you've cut it back, do a pre-treatment. Go ahead and use your neem oil or your serenade ahead of time before you start to see those leaves really starting to come out. I usually wait until I see just a little bit of bud starting to open up, and then I get out there and I start treating them right away to get ahead of the leaf spot problem. And that's something we have to do here at the nursery as well. We go ahead and we just pre-treat all of our rose bushes, because that's certainly not something we want to see show up magically. By Mother's Day, we start to see all our roses coming underneath a black leaf spot. And that's a big problem for us here in the Northwest, because as you know, we're dealing with moisture quite a bit during the late winter, early spring. So it's just a disease that will drive you crazy unless you get a hold of it. Now, there are a lot of rose varieties and vegetable varieties that are now coming out that are resistant to a lot of these funguses and diseases, which is great. They're hybridizing them now so they're stronger and they can resist a lot of these diseases. However, your average everyday gardener could use a little help. And there's all kinds of it out there. You'll find all kinds of varieties of fungicides, but I tried to keep it as simple as possible for you folks today. Keep it down to 3 or 4 choices so that you're not walking in the store completely confused. Alright, you guys, so hopefully I've answered most of your questions. I hope all of you are having a fantastic pre-spring so far. Most of you have thawed out by now and are starting to recuperate. But just think, only 30 days from now, as I'm filming this on February 21st, spring is just around the corner, and I can't wait, and we're starting to fill up fast here at the nursery. Alright, you guys, we'll talk soon. In my next video, I'm going to start covering a lot more new plants that we're starting to receive here at the nursery, and I'm super excited to start doing that. Alright, you guys, get out there and beat that fungus, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now.